There's been many gaming consoles that have come and gone that could be categorized as disappointments or letdowns. Systems that never received the support they needed to grow, leading to software that underwhelmed and left its owners feeling ripped off or regretting their purchase. Sega fans, both former and current, should know exactly what I mean. To make a top 10 on this subject, it almost has to be personal. Since our experiences define everything about a gaming system, I doubt you'd see two lists that were exactly the same. For me, expectation played a huge role in how I viewed gaming devices. When something like the Apple Pippin or Casio Loopy came along and failed, I never thought they'd amount to anything in the first place, so they don't rank very high on a list like this. Hell, judging by the sales of those disasters, most gamers felt the same way. No, in order for something to make my biggest letdown list, it had to be hardware I thought had a chance to really amount to something in the first place. Whether that was because of the platform's power, its developers, or even its pedigree, there had to be reasons there for me to think positive about its future. That really got me to thinking, what has been the most disappointing game consoles to grace the market? What has come along and let me down so spectacularly that it left me genuinely sad it never went anywhere? In this episode, we tackle that very topic and go over a list of my biggest console letdowns. Keep in mind that I made this list very personal because of the subject matter, and it reflects my own personal experiences heavily. Hope you guys enjoy the top 10 biggest console letdowns. Our first entry coming in at number 10 is the mega hyped, but short-lived, Panasonic M2. This began life as a 3D accelerator add-on for the 3DO, before being spun off into a fully featured standalone product. At least that was the plan. This product was talked about constantly in 1995. Magazines wrote articles with talk of power close to that of the Sega Model 3 arcade board, basically promoting hardware that would absolutely eviscerate anything on the market at the time. There was even talk about including a DVD drive in the thing. I remember Next Generation magazine getting me so hyped for this, thinking that this was the second coming and the next big thing. After 3DO sold the plans and design to Panasonic, there were huge delays in its release before it finally was canceled as a consumer-level games machine in 1997. The product that eventually launched based on its technology was a multimedia device meant for kiosks to promote businesses and education. It was a massive letdown because it went from being potentially this incredible piece of technology that had third parties like Konami and Capcom lined up to support it, to something that didn't even play real video games. It was a big lesson in the fine line between reality and vaporware. On a curious note, Konami did use the M2 spec in a number of arcade games, but that was as close to a games machine as the M2 ever got. Believe it or not, our entry coming in at number 9 was the Philips CD-I. While this thing became a joke that is scoffed at today, way back in 1991 it held a load of promise. It was powered by a super fast 68,000 CPU, had a megabyte of RAM, and could display a ton of color. It was backed by Philips, who advertised the living hell out of the thing, even going as far as to do infomercials talking up its abilities. But instead of courting game developers to make traditional software using all its potential, Philips embraced full motion video and multimedia software to try to sell the CD-I. This led to a library of titles that just didn't do any justice to the hardware. And justice it needed, because it was nearly $1,000 when the thing first came out. Instead of unique software that could have looked incredible, many of its games were ports from computers and other game consoles. In effect, it suffered many of the same issues that plagued Sega's CD platform. In the end, it had a library that was wholly unimpressive, including a few Mario and Zelda titles that are considered the worst in their well-respected series. If you ever want to read up on a company that handled a games machine completely wrong that wasn't named Sega, the Philips CD-I fits the bill. I remember our 8th entry so well because it was a console I didn't actually own. It was 1987 and my best buddy Charles had just gotten an Atari 7800 and a few games. We played the heck out of it there for a few months, really getting into stuff like Food Fight, Choplifter, and Pole Position 2. It really did seem like it was a well-designed platform, and it played the old 2600 cartridges as well. It was priced right too, coming in at just $79 with a pack-in. I was thinking that with as popular as Atari was before, this thing was gonna be huge. What I didn't know at the time was that Atari had developed the 7800 way back in 1984 and had been sitting on it due to financial difficulties and its eventual sale. The new company that owned the 7800 didn't have the same level of funds and third-party support to keep it competitive. This led to a drought of software that strangled any real chance this thing had its success. By the time software finally did start kicking up in 88 and 89, it didn't really matter anymore. Nintendo had a stranglehold on the US market, and nobody was gonna challenge that. What had started off as a console that I had enjoyed and considered getting myself quickly fizzled into just another victim of Nintendo's immense popularity. When the magazines of the time began talking about our 7th entry, the NEC PCFX, I had visions of the ultimate follow-up to the PC Engine. While the TurboGrafx 16 had failed in the US, the PC Engine had a great library in Japan, and the follow-up had the potential to do the same. But as the software library became known, it was clear that NEC, Hudson, and its third parties had a very different idea of the kinds of games consumers wanted to play. NEC was convinced that its competition that produced rudimentary polygons was doomed, so it instead developed hardware that was really strong at producing 2D images and video. They wanted adventure and role-playing games based on anime franchises that featured its video processing power, which of course meant that the great lineup of stuff that was on the PC Engine was nowhere to be found. NEC also charged over $400 for the thing, an absurd amount for hardware that completely ignored the polygon revolution. Third parties showed little interest in supporting this idea, and after only about 60 games, the PCFX crashed and burned in Japan, the only country it was ever released in. It serves as one of the biggest letdowns in gaming history and sold less than 500,000 units in 4 years. When our 6th entry, Nintendo's 32-bit Virtual Boy, showed up in 1995, I was all kinds of excited to play the thing. Back in the 90s, virtual reality was all the rage. The thought of moving around in a true 3D world was intriguing, and anyone that saw the Lawnmower Man back in the day probably had similar feelings. Of course, when Nintendo launched it and you actually played it, a different kind of reality set in. One of utter disappointment. The red and black screen was brutal on your eyes, the thing wasn't portable in the slightest, the controller sucked to high heaven, and most of the games were well below Nintendo's usually high standards. It did get a few fun games like Wario Land, but overall Nintendo really shat the bed with this thing. The level of failure this endured is legendary among Nintendo systems. It sold less than 800,000 units and had a game library of just 22 officially released titles. Nintendo supported it less than 6 months before giving up and dropping it altogether. Imagine paying $180 for this at launch and then having to swallow there would be no more games for it after only a handful of months. Say what you will about Sega, but not even they screwed their customers over that badly. Yep, you are seeing that right. 2 Nintendo products back to back on our list. Number 5 here was the Wii U, released in 2012. I picked this up at launch and had a blast with the thing. It had a number of fantastic Nintendo releases that my family and I played for hours on end. I really enjoyed the ability to play games on the tablet controller, many of which you didn't need the TV at all. But when it came to third-party support, the Wii U was a massive letdown for me. After the initial volley of launch titles, third-party support seemed to disappear overnight. Before long, the only things coming out that were really worth playing was from Nintendo themselves. To make matters worse, the Wii U hardware was not particularly powerful, leading to many of its games not looking or running much better than what we were seeing on the Xbox 360 and PlayStation 3, two consoles that were much older. After 5 years on the market, the Wii U faded away to nothingness as the Switch replaced it. It had just a bit over 200 physical games released for it in that time, and sold only 13 million units worldwide, a paltry number when compared to even the Nintendo 64. I loved what Nintendo created for it, but when it came to being a viable platform with a diverse library, it left a lot to be desired. Number 4 may come as a surprise, but in 1993 I was actually looking forward to the Atari Jaguar as much as the 3DO. I went with the latter, and it wasn't until late 1994 that I finally got my hands on one thanks to my good buddy Nathan. He decided to pick it up and a few games to see what all the fuss was about. I had seen all the Jaguar ads talking about doing the math and how incredible its 64 bits of power were. Seeing pics of games like Doom, Tempest 2000, Alien vs. Predator, and Wolfenstein 3D, it seemed like this thing had the power to get the job done. The Jaguar was also priced aggressively at $250 with a pack-in, far less than its 32-bit competition at the time. But it became clear to me that the Jaguar had the same issues that the 7800 had. It just didn't have a very compelling software library. Most of its better games could be played elsewhere, and most of the exclusives were not really all that great. After just a year and a half on the market, game releases slowed to a crawl and sales plummeted to virtually nothing. Estimates put it at 150,000 or so, but I seriously doubt they were even that close. Add in the fact that it had one of the worst game controllers ever designed, and a CD attachment that had just 13 titles released for it, and the Jaguar was one of the biggest letdowns in console history. If you have been following my channel for a while, number 3 should come as no surprise. I absolutely loved my Nintendo 64, and when the 64DD was announced, I thought for sure this thing was Nintendo's answer to its cartridge problems. This was a floppy drive add-on that had 64 megabytes of storage and was released in late 1999. But it was clear that there were problems right from the get-go. The 64DD had been officially announced in late 1996, and it took 3 years to materialize. Things started off with articles of massive third-party support, Nintendo's first-party games, and even cheaper reissues of existing cartridge titles. When the Japanese version landed in 1999, it had no major support from anyone, not even Nintendo, and less than a dozen software releases were produced for it. Its best release, an expansion to F-Zero X, still needed the Nintendo 64 cartridge to even work. The hardware sold a staggeringly low 15,000 units in the time it was on the Japanese market, seeing a release nowhere else. Nintendo knew it was gonna tank and pretty much stopped making the device as soon as the initial batch shipped. All that talk of how it would revolutionize Nintendo 64 releases, and we ended up seeing none of that. It was another Nintendo device that crashed and burned worse than anything Sega was responsible for. To date, thanks to its cost and rarity, I have never seen or played any real games for this device. You knew it had to be here, and our number 2 entry is none other than Sega's 32X. This was released in 1994 as an add-on for the Sega Genesis. Initially, I had questions about how Sega planned to support multiple 32-bit consoles, but the upcoming release list had games from big third parties and a number of great Sega franchises. But that first batch of games left me wondering if Sega had bitten off more than it could chew. Stuff like Virtua Racing Deluxe had been cool, but then you had games like Cosmic Carnage and the awful Motocross Championship. Then came the avalanche of cancellations. Aliens vs. Predator, cancelled. Darkstalkers, cancelled. Castlevania, cancelled. Soulstar X, cancelled. Not just the third-party stuff fell victim to this deluge of software being canned. We also lost the 32X Outrun port, Power Drift, Sonic, and many more. After less than 2 years, Sega dropped it, having sold only 800,000 units worldwide and releasing only about 40 titles. What had started as Sega of America's backup plan to the high cost of the Saturn ended in a total meltdown that no doubt damaged consumer confidence on a pretty spectacular level. I wanted it to be so much more, but the market had other plans. Our number one spot is reserved for a console I wanted so badly at its release. I actually imported the thing not long after. NEC Super Graphics was supposed to be the big upgrade needed to take the battle to the Mega Drive and Super Famicom in Japan. It added a number of new features to the base PC engine, such as 4 times the RAM, a new video controller, twice the on-screen sprites, another background layer, and it was compatible with both PC Engine games and the CD-ROM attachments. When it launched in late 1989, I was so interested in seeing what it was about. When screens of Daimakai Mora started circling, I just knew this sucker had some serious horsepower. But time quickly made it clear that something was very wrong with the platform. Games were nowhere to be found. I mean, almost nothing came out for it despite its much higher price point than its competition. It took months to get something new, and after only 7 official releases, NEC cut it loose and stopped selling the thing. A major casualty in that cancellation was the Supergrafx port of Strider, which was moved over to the PC Engine CD-ROM. It was yet another lesson of letting my hopes get up for something based on just a few games, and is easily my biggest disappointment for a games console. Like I said in the beginning, a list like this really has no choice but to be personal. When and where you played these consoles will have a profound effect on how you felt about them. I would love to hear what system let you down the most and why. What made this list so fun for me was the fact that some of these consoles are actually pretty good. It's just the overall experience that was a letdown. A machine like the Wii U was a letdown that felt completely different from something like the Atari Jaguar. Whereas I really loved my Wii U, that disappointment was born from wanting it to have more success, while the Jaguar was the kind of disappointment that stemmed from being underwhelmed after high expectations. Making this list brought back a flood of memories and games I haven't played in years, which actually gave me a slew of new ideas for future videos. If you'd like to see me cover some of these platforms in dedicated episodes, let me know down in the comments and I'll see what I can do. I'm Sega Lord X, thank you guys for watching, and I will catch you next time.